to London around a year ago, and while I was there I did my part in collecting tales. From grand museums to posh bookstores I found more than enough material to make a few ghoulish stories, but it was by chance in a small antique parlor that I found a tale that truly made my blood run cold. It was an old leather-bound journal that detailed the happenings of one Ashton Whitfield. He was a pilot during the First World War, and most of the journal was the regular wartime discourse, flights in and out of combat, heroic stands against German fighters, but it was the last chapter that really grabbed my attention. It started with a reconnaissance flight that Ashton and his co-pilot, Owen, in the journal, took to scout out German trenches and positions. They set out on a clear blue September morning and flew over the scarred French countryside. They passed over the last British trench and went into no man's land. They then glided into German territory, but as soon as they entered, they were enveloped by an all-consuming mist. Now this was unexpected for them, as they would not have been ordered to fly had the spotters seen such a hazardous weather. You see, without modern instruments, it was near impossible to fly in such a hazardous condition. The air was deathly silent, all except for the roar of their plane's engines. But it was suddenly interrupted when a limbless tree seemed to come for them out of the fog and struck the wing of their plane. They were closer to the ground than either of them expected, and they made an unceremonious landing in an embankment of mud. Remarkably, both Ashton and Owen lived through the crash. Ashton had a few minor injuries, but Owen was worse for wear. He had had his hand on the machine gun in the rear cockpit of the plane, and when they crashed, it had been wrenched, dislocating his shoulder. Ashton used his knife to cut off the sleeve of his jacket and make an impromptu sling, and they were now stuck in the middle of enemy territory in an unpierceable fog. They could not make any sense of direction, so they just decided to pick a direction and walk for what felt like hours over ruins and craters and shell holes until they came to a deep trench whose bottom was enveloped in fog. This was a welcome relief for the pilots, though, as they knew if they followed the trench works, eventually they had to reach the front line, and they could then cross no man's land and return to their home along the British lines. So they sat for upwards of an hour at the edge of the trench, listening for German soldiers below, the whole time steeped in an oppressive silence. Eventually, Ashton and Owen both agreed that their best bet was to follow the trench to the front line and do their best to avoid any German soldiers they may run into along the way. So they leapt into the trench and began to creep along, all the while coming across empty machine gun positions, abandoned sniper posts, deserted shell holes. The eerie silence began to make their skin crawl. Had the Germans retreated? Why then had they left all their equipment? And why had the British not advanced to take this position? The answers continued to elude them until eventually they reached a large wooden door in the side of the trench. In German, a sign on the front of the door read, "Kommandoposten." And from what little German they had picked up on the front, that meant, of course, command post. They knew that they could find something of value in there to bring back to British command, so they began to pull on the door, but it was caked in a filthy mud, and they could not pry it open. They gave it one more mighty heft, and it suddenly gave way, revealing a dimly lit interior for but a moment before a hysterical German soldier came running out of the darkness, screaming, "Ratte, Ratte!" He ran down the trench, disappearing into the fog, before either of them had a chance to react. This shook the pilots, as it was the first sign of life they had seen since crashing their plane upwards of 7 hours ago. But they stayed resolute and proceeded inside the dugout. Now, dugouts like this were not uncommon during the war, as soldiers built large, intricate cave systems as to hide from the pounding enemy artillery. But all the same, this dugout that should have been full was empty. an empty barracks, an empty armory, an empty mess hall, and eventually they came to the last room in the dugout, the commander's quarters. And what they found there made even the seasoned pilots queasy. When they opened the door, on the floor of the quarters was a skeleton, picked entirely clean and stained with blood. The only identifying factors, a steel helmet still loosely hanging on the skull, and a stick grenade clenched tightly in the bony fist of the skeletal officer. While Ashton was trying to fight back the urge to vomit, Owen pried the grenade out of the hand of the skeletal officer and inspected the casing. It was covered in tiny, desperate claw marks. It was then that Ashton noticed a noise that he had not heard before. It was emanating from the walls of the chamber. It was a scratching, and it was getting louder. Suddenly, the dirt wall of the commander's quarters began to shift, and a large, fat, disgusting rat with red, beady eyes made its way onto the floor of the chamber and crawled towards them. Now, this was not an uncommon sight in the filth of the trenches, but all the same, such a malevolent creature still shook Ashton to the bone. Owen made a sudden move and crushed the fat pest under the heel of his boot. But the scratching persisted. And another rat came out of the wall. And then another. And then another. And then it was 5 rats. And then 10 rats. And then 20 rats. And they began to back out of the commander's quarters into the barracks. And the walls began to collapse. But rather than rock and rubble falling from the walls, it was more rats burrowing their way through the earth. A rat fell onto Owen's shoulder and bit him in the neck, and he cried out in shock and threw the creature to the floor in disgust. At the same time, Ashton grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the exit, where they made their way back into the misty trench. But they were still not safe, as the walls of the trench were crawling with a living mass of horrifying rodents. They began to run down the trench through the fog. Ashton looked back to see that the rats had coalesced into a seething mass of fetid, rotten rats, all with their red, beady eyes staring them down. Owen then pulled the grenade from his belt that he had taken from the skeletal officer and began fumbling with it, trying to arm it, but he was hindered by his dislocated shoulder. Just as he managed to arm the grenade, he tripped to the floor of the trench and cried out in pain. Ashton looked back and screamed his name, only in time to see the horde set upon his partner. He was being devoured alive by 1,000 rats, and he was writhing in agony. And Ashton was paralyzed in fear as he watched, and when the horde turned their attention to him, the grenade, still clenched in Owen's fist, went off with a thunderous clap, sending Ashton into the wall of the trench and burying him under a mound of mud and filth. Ashton was blinded by the mud, but he could feel the rats set upon him. Thousands of feet pulsed over his entire body with a palpable rage, but they did not tear into his skin or consume his flesh. They could not detect him under the mound of filth, the very filth that the scourge had been born from. And so there Ashton lied, immobile, unable to stop the thousands of rats crawling over his body. And eventually, whether from sheer fright or exhaustion, Ashton lost consciousness. When he awoke, the fog was gone. There was no sign of Owen, save for a crater 15 feet away from him down the trench. And there were no rats. The fog, having cleared, allowed Ashton to make his way shakily back to the front line, and after a grueling crawl through no man's land, he reached the British positions and presented himself, filthy and torn, to a squad of British troopers, who in turn brought him to their commanding officer. And after a heated debriefing, the commanding officer deemed his story delusions of a soldier who was suffering from severe shell shock. As he was being escorted from the captain's quarters by 2 armed guards, he was ranting and raving about how the captain did not believe his truth when he looked at the floor and saw a large, fat rat scamper and dig its way into the side of the trench. He screamed and fervently broke his captor's grasp, digging at the earth where the rat had just disappeared. His captors were stunned by his lack of sanity, but quickly snapped out of it and imprisoned him in a brig near the edge of the trench works. Eventually, he was transferred to headquarters, where he was evaluated medically and psychiatrically, and he was deemed insane due to shell shock. After all, many soldiers came from the trenches with stories such as these. They were just the result of ears being deafened by thunderous artillery. He was condemned to a mental institution back in England, where he stayed until his death. Many doctors and therapists tried desperately to cure him of his sickness, but he always suffered from the same visions: the unpierceable fog, the seething horde, his partner, his co-pilot being eaten alive, screaming in agony. He would always awaken from such visions before the grenade in Owen's hand ever exploded. But he could never find sleep. In fact, the nurses that served him said that he almost never slept. And when the doctors asked him why he could not sleep, he said, "Every time I close my eyes, I can feel them, their feet pounding over my body like a drum." And so he sat, awake in his mental ward, praying for the eternal release of death.